Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast, I'll be talking about pain, primarily chronic pain, following my interest in the latest research around pain and the neuromatrix model in which our thoughts play a big role in pain perception. I wrote an essay called Pain and the Brain, and it is published in my book Alchemists of Suburbia. I'll be reading from that essay shortly, and then I'll be following with a case study example involving Eddy Chen, a member of TwoSet Violin, which is a very popular musical comedy duo that came to fame on YouTube and has toured around the world. But first, let's start with the essay, Pain and the Brain. Pain. It can stop us in our tracks, preoccupy our thoughts and route our attention to our body. Physiologically speaking, we feel pain only when our brain perceives a threat. You can stub your toe, for example, but unless your brain receives enough information, namely from chemical messages at the site of impact, conveying that your toe needs repair, you won't experience pain. The brain's central role in pain perception is particularly intriguing when it comes to chronic pain with no apparent cause. There doesn't seem to be any reason for the pain. There's no tissue damage, for example, but the brain has nonetheless decided that a certain part of the body is in trouble and so issues the pain order. Complex regional pain syndrome, or CRPS for short, is a condition that can occur in such a scenario. Not only does a person develop chronic pain in an area, but the brain instigates an inflammatory response there, causing swelling and further restriction of movement. Sometimes CRPS develops after a minor injury, such as a sprained ankle. The brain seems to go into overprotective parent mode, issuing a response that is excessive and relentless. As an aside here, I first became aware of CRPS from watching a television program about it. And in the program, they interviewed a young woman who had been going to begin her venture of studying veterinary science at university. And on the day when she was going to enroll for the course, as she walked up the steps to the university, she fell and sprained her ankle. And this is exactly what happened to her. She developed CRPS. After the sprain, which really wasn't major, after it had healed, or should have healed, and according to scans and other tests, there was nothing wrong with the ankle. But for some reason, the brain was still sending messages saying there was catastrophic damage down there at her ankle, and the visual of her foot was quite striking. It was swollen, it was red, it was so debilitating that she now got by using a wheelchair. And it was so debilitating pain-wise that she withdrew from the course. She couldn't begin her veterinary science training. And I found this fascinating, and hence the research into CRPS and this essay. Now I'll get back to the essay. No one knows the exact cause of CRPS or of many other chronic pain conditions, but the latest neuroscience research suggests that our thoughts play a significant role. Catastrophic thinking, or catastrophizing, thinking things such as, I can't stand it, or it's going to get worse, I'll never be able to get rid of it, or it's going to spread. All of these kind of thoughts amplify chronic pain. This makes sense when you understand that the brain's pain response is proportional to the degree of threat it perceives, and that our thoughts contribute to such perception. If there's one thing I remember from my first aid training, it's to be as calm and reassuring as you can when helping someone out, as this can lessen their distress and experience of pain. From the point of view of A Course in Miracles, catastrophic thinking is related to guilt over separating from God and a fear of retribution. If we believe we are a guilty ego self, and of course this is all on an unconscious level, then we'll also believe that things are going to get worse for us. When we think like this, our pain, our suffering, increases. As masochistic as it might sound, suffering holds some attraction in that it mitigates our fear of something worse happening to us further down the track. We might think, unconsciously, if God sees how much suffering I'm in now, surely he won't punish me for the sin of separation. So how might we approach chronic pain from a Course point of view? The Course tells us that everything we experience reflects a decision to identify with either our ego or with our spiritual self, to believe in separation or unity, in guilt or innocence. Ultimately, this decision leads to feeling threatened or safe. Catastrophic thinking is then a reflection of choosing to identify with the ego and hence with pain. This is, naturally, an intrusion on our peace. Importantly, however, it's not the case that we should be pain-free if we have chosen to listen to the Holy Spirit and remember our self. That's the capital S self, the spiritual self. Like any other feeling, pain can be used to root us in the world or to remember our true identity as spirit. Pain, per se, isn't the problem. Just as we can feel hungry, hot, tired, or cold, we can feel pain, which is really another type of discomfort. And just as feeling hungry isn't an indication that you're in your wrong mind, neither is experiencing pain or taking medication for it. It's what we do with our discomfort, how we interpret it, that can either let it move into the background of our experience or take centre stage. In other words, what will we use the pain for? We are always setting a goal as to what we want to emphasise about ourselves and the world, and this will determine our inner experience. This is the quote from the Course. In any situation in which you are uncertain, the first thing to consider very simply is, what do I want to come of this? What is it for? The clarification of the goal belongs at the beginning, for it is this which will determine the outcome. In the ego's procedure, this is reversed. The situation becomes the determiner of the outcome. End of quote. The ego's goal is to keep us from our mind, where our power lies, by trying to convince us that the body and the world are the causes of our distress, and that the world contains the source of our pleasure or our sense of well-being and happiness. This serves the ego's purpose nicely. It makes the world very real in our experience, along with the past, the body, and our sense of victimisation, whether at the hands of another person, a bug, or our own actions. Our thoughts have no role to play in pain if we believe the situation determines the outcome. Like the brain, the ego would have us believe that the intensity of our pain is proportional to the amount of damage done to us. But the brain gets it wrong, and so does the ego. To the ego, pain says the world is real and God's unity is dead. That's a scary, catastrophic thought. If, however, we make our goal to remember who we are, we can ask the Holy Spirit to help us look at our pain without fear. And as we choose to release everyone from any guilt surrounding this pain, we allow the pain to recede into the background. Maybe we associate our pain with having been overworked, neglected, abused, or unsupported. Or maybe it's the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of all we have endured in our life generally. The Holy Spirit looks on our pain and says, not one note in heaven's song was missed. We are not damaged, in danger, or a prisoner to what we have done or has been done to us. Our goal then isn't so much to be pain-free, but to let go of guilt and grievances. Then our pain won't be exacerbated, and as it loses its ability to distract us from the Holy Spirit's answer, which would be some remembrance of our holiness and eternal safety and an experience of peace, in other words. Our pain may indeed go altogether at times, but it won't be a big deal either way. Forgiveness and peace will be the outcome, and we'll be able to do whatever it is that would constitute moving forward. That is the end of the essay. So what I'd like to do now is give another example of a mysterious type of pain and how it can relate to unresolved inner conflicts. And it involves two violinists who form the comedy duo TwoSet Violin, who is hugely popular. TwoSet Violin consists of Brett Yang and Eddy Chen, and they're both from Brisbane, Australia. I came across them when searching for some YouTube videos on Hilary Hahn, who is a legendary violinist, and I appreciate her music and her playing and her thoughts. In interviews, she says some wonderful, helpful things, not only to be applied to music and musicianship, but you can really apply it to your life as well. Even though that's not necessarily her intent, I do get that benefit from listening to her in interviews. Anyway, so I was looking for some Hilary Hahn material, and YouTube kindly suggested this video called The Ling Ling Workout. Now, it's a TwoSet Violin video where they do musical challenges that only this fictional character, which they've called Ling Ling, could possibly do. They're impossible musical challenges, really, but this fictional character Ling Ling stands for that student who is perfect, a perfect prodigy, and every demanding parent wants their child to be like Ling Ling. Anyway, in this particular Ling Ling workout, they feature Hilary Hahn. Hilary was also a fan of their work. They were a fan of Hilary's, and apparently they got chatting over social media and came to do some collaboration, and this video is one of them. So they do challenges like playing a particular passage from a piece of music, a difficult piece, while doing the hula hoop. Like, I don't know what you call doing the hula hoop, but you got a hula hoop around you and you're twirling it about while playing the violin. And I have to say, Hilary manages the task brilliantly, and they're in awe of her, as you would be. Then one of the tasks is reversing your right and left hand. So whatever hand you use to do the bowing, you now use to do the fretwork, and vice versa with the other hand. And of course, that is very difficult, but you get the idea of the Ling Ling workout. And you get the idea of TwoSet Violin, the kind of musical comedy that Brett and Eddy came to, and that really touched on a need in the musical community to have some humour around the difficulties in music and the pressure to practice. They end up hugely successful on YouTube, and they toured around the world, and in their live audiences, I love it, at the end they often just say, "Go practice," and everybody can relate to that emphasis from the parents, that emphasis from the high standards of the musical community. Go practice. Anyway, this idea of pressure in the musical community is really what this particular story of illness is about. Now, I came across the story of the illness on an Australian television program called Australian Story, and it's from the 2023 series, and the title of the episode is Taking a Bow, if anybody wants to look it up. Hopefully you can get to see it in your region. Now, in this episode, we learn that Eddy, who had been practicing violin from a very early age, I think he was 5 maybe when he started. Anyway, he was the son, both of them are sons of immigrants from Taiwan. And as is a common story with immigrants who come to Australia or any other country for a better future for their children, there can be a lot of pressure on the children to do well, and to at least try to do well in their education. This is also why when Eddy was old enough to go to university, his mum wanted him to kind of drop music and become a doctor. She wanted him to study medicine at university. However, Eddy had grown to really love classical music, and he really wanted to study music. and this became a conflict with his mum. In the end, she relented and Eddy took on musical studies at university. Well, when Eddy was about 20 years old, he found that he was obsessive about his practice. He was so perfectionistic. He was really driving himself into the ground with his training. All of that stress seemed to have accumulated, and he ended up suffering a mysterious pain in his right arm, which then progressed to his left arm. And then the pain progressed to his legs. And it was so debilitating that he ended up in a wheelchair and wasn't able to attend the university for classes. He sought the help of a neurologist who did several tests on him and concluded that there wasn't anything physically wrong with Eddy, that it was a psychosomatic pain. And with a bit of investigation as to why it might be manifesting, Eddy reflected that the pressure that he was putting himself under with his musical studies to be perfect related to his decision to go against his mother, who had wanted him to study medicine. He now felt that he had to prove himself and to prove to his mother that it was worthwhile, that his decision to go against her and study music was worthwhile and that he would get somewhere with it. Once he realised that this was going on, and I don't know if doesn't go on in the documentary about whether he discussed this with his mum, but once he developed some insight into what was going on, he was able to work with the neurologist around the pain and come to some resolution of it. Now, the neurologist said to him that there was no danger, nothing dangerous going on in his body. Like we were discussing earlier in the essay, the brain's determination that there was, and therefore producing the pain, the brain was wrong. And so there was no problem. What he needed to deal with was his catastrophic thinking, was his worry about the pain, because it is really distressing when you have a pain and you don't know where it's coming from and it seems to take over your body as it did with Eddy. That's the kind of nature of psychosomatic pain. It develops that life of its own. It's very disconcerting and the pain is real and it is debilitating. But once Eddy could understand that he wasn't in any physical danger, that everything was intact, and the neurologist coached him to kind of push through the pain a bit, that there's a certain amount that's helpful and a certain amount that's not. You don't want to push through it too much. But the neurologist would have guided him through this. In 2 days, he was able to get out of the wheelchair. That's how much of a transformation this knowledge of where the conflict was coming from and the stress was coming from, and how to work with it with a neurologist in terms of dealing with this kind of pain and knowing that there's nothing wrong. So to really put to bed those catastrophic thoughts, how much that helped him. And then he was able to slowly get back into the swing of things. Eventually, Eddy was able to return to uni, to his studies there, and he graduated and played in orchestras. And as we now know, him and Brett continued with their video skits, which they had actually begun when Eddy was recovering during that period of convalescence before he returned to university. And that has become a huge part of their lives now. That is where their focus is. And it's interesting that as Eddy recovered, as so often is the case when we recover from a traumatic experience, we are able to give something to the world that is a healing thing for them. And the kind of comedy that Eddy and Brett do is like, I imagine, a kind of salve or balm for all the musical students out there, young and old, who feel the pressures of that industry and that emphasis on being perfect. Well, Eddy and Brett help to kind of break that a bit and provide some humour into an arena that can be very, very serious and take itself very seriously. And that can be so healing for everybody involved. And the evidence is in the popularity of their performances, not just on YouTube, but their live performances. They have toured around the world. They've played at the Lincoln Center in the US. They've played all over the place. And the crowds are really, really appreciative of their gift. And so we have the archetype of the wounded healer, which is also the archetype that Carl Jung identified with. Through going through his deep inner process, he was then able to help others, as we all are. As A Course in Miracles says, in crucifixion is redemption laid, so that pain can motivate us to go inward and to look at those conflicts, to finally bring them to light. And when we do move forward through forgiveness and the Holy Spirit's help, we will feel revitalized in what we do. I'll always remember a quote from Joseph Campbell that struck me when I first read it many, many years ago. He said that where people say they're looking for meaning in life, he felt that what they were really looking for was an experience of being alive. And I think there's a lot to that. If we all felt vital and felt buoyant, would we be thinking, what's the meaning of life so much? Maybe we are, like Joseph Campbell said, really just seeking an experience of being alive. And that is where A Course in Miracles leads us, because an experience of wholeness means we are not employing energy to defend ourselves in various ways by holding aspects of ourselves at bay through shame or guilt. The section in the manual which says, what is the resurrection? It says that the resurrection is when we see the only purpose in the world as being forgiveness. Well, that means that we no longer have a need for special hate and special love relationships in the world, which means we no longer have a need to defend ourselves from shame and guilt. We no longer feel a lack within. We no longer feel empty. We no longer feel lonely. We feel whole. If we see the only purpose of the world to be forgiveness, then we're there. And then we would feel vital. Okay, so I think I shall leave it there for today. Thank you very much for listening. Tune in again. Bye.